Okay, so our topic for, I guess, the next couple of sessions is ethical egoism. Ethical egoism, you remember, we defined as the view that everyone always ought to act selfishly, and we've already talked about the way in which it is distinct from psychological egoism, which is also, we saw the way in which sort of any two parallel theories, such that one's a factual theory and the other's an evaluative theory, are distinct. We're going to spend, most of the time that talking about ethical egoism looking at arguments for and against. Before we do that, though, I think it's important to say something about how to understand ethical egoism, which is also relevant to understanding what the default here is. That is, to understanding to what extent ethical egoism is like or unlike psychological egoism in as to whether it starts out at a significant, apparent intellectual disadvantage. The thing I want to say here, if you want to capture it in a slogan, is this: ethical egoism is a bad name for the view. A better name would be rational egoism. Let me expand on that. Right? So look, if you call the view ethical egoism, what that suggests is that it is primarily, in the first instance, a view about ethics, a view about what morality tells you to do, about the source of moral duties and obligations. Understood that way, it would, I think, start out at a significant intellectual disadvantage. Because look, we ordinarily think, that morality at least sometimes requires us to act against our own interests. That ordinary thought is one that you're liable to pick up pretty early in your moral training when you get, when you're in preschool and you're forced to share toys when you don't want to, right? And you're given the sense that, sharing toys is something that you ought to do in some proto-moral way, even though it's not what you want to do, right? So, given that very familiar understanding of some of what morality involves, it would be surprising if morality really turned out all to be a matter of doing what's in your own interest, right? So, if you understand the view as primarily, in the first instance, a view about ethics, as ethical egoism sort of properly speaking, it starts out at a disadvantage. But I think that's really not the right way to understand it. Most people, I think, who've put forward this view, including Hobbes actually, have not intended it as primarily and in the first instance a view about ethics, about what morality requires of it. They have understood it rather as primarily in the first instance a view about reason, about what it is rational or sensible for us to do. Understood that way, the view, I think, doesn't start out at an intellectual disadvantage. Right? The view that what it's rational or sensible for us to do is just look out for our own interests strikes lots of people as a fairly sensible view. Perhaps not obviously right, but not obviously wrong either. Yeah? And I think, as I say, that's what people in the tradition who are attracted to views of this kind have in mind. And I think it's the best, as it were, charitable interpretation of what the view really is. Now, as you know, right, in his chapter on it, Rachels calls the view ethical egoism. In deference to that, I'm going to continue to use that term. I'm going to continue to call it ethical egoism. But, with the proviso we've just gone over, with the proviso that really the view is better understood as rational egoism, not as ethical egoism, better understood as primarily in the first instance a view about what reason or rationality tells us to do, rather than as primarily in the first instance a view about what morality tells us to do. Okay? Now, you might be forgiven, at least on the basis of some of our discussions, for forming the impression that philosophy in general, maybe moral philosophy in particular, consists largely of looking at collections of bad arguments, right? Bad arguments in favor of views, bad arguments against them. Whatever the merits of that general picture of what philosophy, moral philosophy, introductory moral philosophy classes or whatever consist of, it is, by his own admission, largely what Rachel's chapter on ethical egoism consists of, right? As Rachel sees it, his chapter on ethical egoism is in large part a collection of bad arguments in favor of ethical egoism, bad arguments against it. Rachel's, however, thinks it is not wholly like that, right? He thinks that he has to offer at the end a good argument against ethical egoism, sort of the one good argument in the chapter. I'm going to claim, though, that he's wrong about that. I'm going to claim that what he takes to be a good argument against ethical egoism is not really. So I'm going to argue that his chapter really is entirely a collection of bad arguments on either side. And so far as what his chapter tells us, our view on ethical egoism should be that we've seen neither decisive reason to believe it nor decisive reason to reject it. So our verdict on ethical egoism, I'm going to argue, should be different from our verdict on psychological egoism, which we saw good reason to reject. Okay, so turn then to those arguments. I want to sample first two arguments in favor of ethical egoism. The first such argument I want to get pretty directly from Rachel's treatment. This is the argument that he talks about under the heading, the argument that altruism is self-defeating, on pages 70 and 71 of the Elements of Moral Philosophy. So, the general ideas on which this argument trades, as he tells us, are the ideas that each of us is sort of better placed and better motivated to promote our own interests than others are, right? And that being so, the thought is the best thing is for each of us to pursue our own interests exclusively. Rachel's formulates this argument on top of the right hand, never mind, top of page 71. Right? And it's useful to inspect that formulation, and we have that on the PowerPoint here. So as ever, when we've formulated an argument, that is when we have a clear statement of the premises and the conclusion, what two questions do we want to ask about it? Validity and soundness, or perhaps a little better when you're doing the questions, read them off the definition of soundness. So, is it valid? Are the premises true? Yeah. All right. Start with the first question about this argument then. Is it valid? It is, yes. Yes, it's a valid argument. All right. Now, this is a valid two-premise argument, right? Rachel's, you may recollect, doesn't think it's a sound argument. He doesn't think there are any sound arguments for ethical egoism. He doesn't think this is one. Right? He makes two criticisms, has two objections to this argument. On the usual pattern, what would you expect those two criticisms to be? I mean, if someone thinks a two-premise argument is valid, but it's not sound, and thinks that there are two problems with it, the usual pattern would be that those two problems are what?
Contradictory.
Not necessarily contradictory, no. False premises, yeah. I mean, the standard thing to say would be, standard form of such a criticism would be, abstractly, right? If it's valid but not sound, there are two things wrong with it. One thing wrong with it is sort of premise one is false. The other thing wrong with it is premise two is false, right? Yeah, that's right. What's striking about Rachel's criticism of this argument is that it does not exactly follow that standard pattern, right? It only partly does, right? One of Rachel's criticisms, as we'll see in a sec, really is to the effect that one of the premises is false. But the other is not. The other is something different, right? And it's useful to see that that different stuff, right? So, hang on. So look, the first thing he says really is to the effect that a premise is false, right? Specifically, premise two, the premise that best way to promote everyone's interest is for each of us to adopt the policy of pursuing our own interests exclusively. He talks about this in the final full paragraph on 70, right? He says, it's possible to object to this argument on a number of grounds. Of course, no one favours bungling, butting in, or depriving people of their self-respect. But is that really what we're doing when we feed hungry children? Is the starving child in Ethiopia really harmed when we intrude into her business by supplying food? It hardly seems likely. So there's the criticism then that follows the standard pattern, right? Yeah. Argument's valid, but it's not sound. Here's a premise that's false, premise two. Yeah. But then Rachel goes on to give another criticism, which is, as I say, does not follow that standard pattern, if you read just from where we were. So can someone tell me what that second criticism amounts to? What's he say there? Yes?
Is it that premise one is contradictory to the definition of ethical egoism?
Yeah, that's the idea, right? So the idea is, what Rachel says is, properly understood, premise one is incompatible with ethical egoism. So, properly understood, this is not an argument for ethical egoism at all, right? It's not that Rachel thinks that premise one is false. Rachel quite likes premise one, right? I mean, his point rather is that when you understand what premise one says, and when you understand, therefore, the character of the conclusion, you'll see that what you've got isn't really an argument for ethical egoism. Here's how he puts it. I'll skip a little bit, partly because the paragraph where he says this also includes the formulation of the argument. He writes, starting with the final paragraph on 70, right? The trouble is that it isn't really an argument for ethical egoism at all. The argument concludes that we should adopt certain policies of behavior And on the surface, they appear to be egoistic policies. However, the reason we should adopt those policies is decidedly unegoistic. It is said that adopting those policies will promote the betterment of society. But according to ethical egoism, that is not something we should care about. Skipping a bit. If we accept this reasoning, then we are not ethical egoists. Even though we might end up behaving like egoists, our ultimate principle is one of beneficence. We're doing what we think will help everyone, not merely what we think will benefit ourselves. Rather than being egoists, we turn out to be altruists with a peculiar view of what promotes the general welfare. All right. So, I got a version of this on the PowerPoint too, if we can slip back over to the PowerPoint there. Yeah, okay, so that's the other criticism, and that's the one, right, that isn't of the sort of usual form. Huh? All right, so is everyone clear about this argument and Rachel's criticisms of it? Okay. All right, I want to look at one other argument for ethical egoism. This argument is sort of in the ballpark of what Rachel talks about in the next section under the heading Ayn Rand's argument. But I don't want to consider exactly what he there considers, because I guess, well, not all philosophers, but most philosophers, I tend to think that Ayn Rand isn't a very good philosopher. So if we consider the argument in exactly the Ayn Rand version, we're liable to bring in sort of irrelevant problems and complications. and I think we're better off to look at the line of thought in a more straightforward and, to my mind, a more persuasive form. Right? So let me try and characterize then this second sort of argument for ethical egoism. This argument, again, has two premises, right? The first premise is it's a factual premise, although the fact involved is it's a very familiar fact that is sort of so familiar that it may seem hard to conceive what an alternative would be. Right? So the fact in question is what contemporary philosophers sometimes refer to as the separateness of persons. Right? The thought here is that each of us bears a special relationship to his or her own life and experiences that we don't bear to the lives and experiences of other people. Right? We have our own experiences. We live our own lives. We have this sort of, direct, immediate relationship to our own life and experiences, whereas we have only a sort of indirect, mediated relationship to anyone else's. So that's the fact, right? Then, the other premise in this argument for ethical egoism is an evaluative premise. It's about the rational response to that fact. Right? And the other premise says, look, it's rational to be concerned, to care for its own sake, only about lives you will lead or experiences you will have. Put those together, and you get a straightforward two-premise argument for ethical egoism. Right? I've got a version of it on the PowerPoint here. So then let's think about this argument. The question we want ultimately to address is this a persuasive argument for ethical egoism? Let's raise that more specifically in this way. If you were going to criticize this little argument, which premise would you criticize and what grounds would you give for criticizing it? What do you think?
Second premise.
Second premise seems plausible, yes. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's the separateness of persons premise understood as a factual premise is hard to criticize. So the obvious premise to criticize is the second premise. On what grounds could you think of criticizing the second premise? Do you anyone have a suggestion there? What might you say by way of criticism? Yes.
Well, it says it's rational to care about basically only your own life. But I mean, in anyone, like in most people's lives, you care about family and your significant others. So.
Yeah. So people do care about family and significant others and stuff. And then, of course, the question is, should you? Right? I mean, you're in just the right area, and I think it's worth seeing how the criticism might be pushed in two different ways, to one of which the advocate of this argument has a natural response, but to the other of which there isn't such a persuasive response. Right? So one way of pushing the criticism is to say, but look, surely it's rational to care about other people's lives because they impact yours. Right? I mean, the lives of your friends and family and so forth have an impact on you. If they're doing badly, it makes you do badly, etc. Right? So surely you should care about them for that reason. If you put it that way, the advocate of this argument has a natural response, right? The advocate of this argument can say, look, what I basically have in mind is the idea that the only thing you should care about for its own sake is your own life and experiences. But of course that is perfectly compatible with caring about other people's lives and experiences to the extent that and because they affect you, right? So, you could amend the argument slightly to make this explicit without changing its basic force, right? I mean, you could insert, to rational care for its own sake or for their own sake, only about lives you will live. So, sort of pushed that way, the criticism is a criticism that I think the advocate of the argument can respond to, right? So, I mean, if that's all one means, then advocate of the argument has a comeback. Right? But look, I mean, the other way to sort of push the criticism is this: is to say, the fact that each of us will live, his or her own life and no one else's, may give each of us a special reason to be concerned with him or herself, right? And a reason to be concerned with him or herself more than with any other individual. But we don't seem to have been presented with any reason why such special concern has to take the form of exclusive concern. I mean, it's one thing to say that you ought to have, a concern for your own life and interests that's greater than your concern for anyone else's. It's quite another thing to say that you ought to be exclusively concerned for your own life and not concerned at all for anyone else, right? So, pushing the criticism in this way, what you say is, the problem with the argument is all that's really justified by it is some form of special concern for your own life and your own experiences. But, what the argument has to do, if it's an argument for ethical egoism, is interpret such special concern as exclusive concern, and there's really no reason that's been supplied to do that. So I think once you understand that criticism, you'll see that, although this is, I think, sort of the best argument for ethical egoism, it's not a decisive sound argument. Yeah? However, it's also, though it's not a sound argument, it's an instructive argument in this way. If you sort of go through and remember the line of thinking involved in setting up this argument for ethical egoism, then you're well placed to see what's wrong with Rachel's favourite argument against ethical egoism. Right? So even though, you know, the payoff from this argument is not decisive reason to believe in ethical egoism, it is a kind of reason to, you know, stay neutral on the topic. Turn then to Rachel's favourite argument against ethical egoism. This is under the heading, "The argument that ethical egoism is unacceptably arbitrary," on pages 77 to 79, you know, starting almost at the top of 77. This is, you know, this is the one argument in this chapter that Rachel thinks does work, and as I've already indicated, I'm going to suggest it does. Yeah. Let me say something about the character of this argument before we turn to its details. Right? In its broad overall character, this argument, Rachel's favourite argument against ethical egoism, is like Marquis's anti-abortion argument, and actually the argument that Marquis's anti-abortion argument is explicitly modelled on, though we'll encounter a bit later, Singer's pro-animal argument. In both cases, as here, what happens is, first we get this justification of a general principle, independent of, without special reference to the subject at hand. So in, you know, the case of Marquis's argument, we talk about, you know, what makes it wrong to kill us, without special reference to abortion. In Singer's argument, as we'll see in a while, we talk about what makes it wrong to discriminate among humans, without special reference to the issues about animals. Here, what Rachel's does is he sort of develops this charge of unacceptable arbitrariness, again without, while developing the charge, any special reference to the case of ethical egoism. Then the second step of the argument in each case is then to argue that this principle or this charge or whatever it is does turn out to apply to the specific case you're interested in. Right? So in this case, the two stages are, first off, Rachel sort of develops this charge of unacceptable arbitrariness. Then he argues, and ethical egoism falls to this charge or problem. So start with the sort of the general charge, right? The general charge is one of, as Rachel's puts it, unacceptable arbitrariness. And he thinks that this is what's wrong with a number of unacceptable moral positions, most prominently racism. Right? Start with the second paragraph under this heading, the second full paragraph on 77. He writes, "There's a whole family of moral views that have this in common. They divide people into groups and say that the interests of some groups count more than the interests of other groups. Racism is the most conspicuous example. Racism divides people into groups according to race and assigns greater importance to the interest of one race than to the interest of other races. All forms of discrimination work this way. Anti-Semitism, nationalism, sexism, ageism, and so on. People in the grip of such views will think, in effect, my race counts for more, or those who believe in my religion count for more, or my country counts for more, and so on. Can such views be defended? The people who accept such views don't usually care to give arguments. Racists, for example, rarely try to offer a rational justification for racism. But suppose they did, what could they say? There is a general principle that stands in the way of any such justification. Let's call it the principle of equal treatment. We should treat people in the same way unless there is a relevant difference between them. For example, suppose we're considering whether to admit 2 students to law school. If both students graduated from college with honours and aced the entrance exam, if both are equally qualified, then it's merely arbitrary to admit one but not the other. However, if one graduated with honours and scored well on the admissions test, while the other dropped out of college and never took the test, then it is acceptable to admit the first student but not the second. And the thought, as you can see, is that, especially sort of old-fashioned racist policies that involve, in the paradigm case, failing to admit or give jobs to black candidates where you would give jobs to or admit similarly or worse qualified white candidates. Right? Such policies violate this principle that Rachel's articulates. They're unacceptably arbitrary. They involve allocating benefits and burdens in ways that are not justifiable. All right, so is everyone sort of clear on the first part of this argument, the charge of unacceptable arbitrariness? Does that make sense? Yeah? All right, so that's the first stage in the argument. So you've got this idea that, moral views are objectionable if in the way that old-fashioned racism is, they are unacceptably arbitrary. Then, in the second stage of the argument, Rachel's goes on to make the claim that ethical egoism is problematic or objectionable in just the same way as racism, that it is in just the same way unacceptably arbitrary. This is the first full paragraph on 79. Rachel's writes, ethical egoism is a moral theory of the same type. It advocates that each of us divide the world into 2 categories of people, ourselves and everyone else, and that we regard the interest of those in the first group as more important than the interest of those in the second group. But each of us can ask, what is the difference between me and everyone else that justifies placing myself in this special category? Am I more intelligent? Are my accomplishments greater? Do I enjoy life more? Are my needs or abilities different from the needs or abilities of others? In short, what makes me so special? Failing an answer, it turns out that ethical egoism is an arbitrary doctrine, in the same way that racism is arbitrary. All right, so I've got a formulation of this argument. It is a bit long. It's the same argument that he's got here. He doesn't explicitly formulate it here. He did in earlier editions of the Elements of Moral Philosophy. So if you want to write this down, which would be a good thing, get ready to write fast. Okay. All right. So here we go with slide 1 for this argument. So this is the sort of the charge of unacceptable arbitrariness. Slide 2 coming in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Everyone got that? Anyone want me to nip back to slide 1 for a second? Okay. I'll nip back to slide 1 for a second. Just make sure you've all got that. All right. So, I've already suggested that if you recall the second argument in favor of ethical egoism, you're going to be in a position to see what's wrong with this argument, with Rachel's favorite argument against it. Does anyone feel able to develop that line of thought? Anyone want to try? No? I'll do it for you then. So look, ethical egoism is not, in this sense, unacceptably arbitrary. The sensible ethical egoist is going to say it's not unacceptably arbitrary for each of us to think of his or her own interest as specially important, because they are specially salient to each of us, right? Each of us will, you know, live our own life, have our own experiences in a way that we don't live the lives or have the experiences of other people. So each of our own lives and experiences really will be specially important to us, right? It's striking, actually, if you look at that paragraph, I'll read you the relevant bits again, in which Rachel's talks about the way in which he pictures the ethical egoist attempting to justify special concern for oneself, right? Here it is again. This is the middle paragraph, first full paragraph on 79. He says, but this is about 4 or 5 lines down. But each of us can ask, what is the difference between me and everyone else that justifies placing myself in this special category? Am I more intelligent? Are my accomplishments greater? Do I enjoy life more? Are my needs or abilities different from the needs or abilities of others? In short, what makes me so special? See, what's striking about that list of questions is that they all involve looking for what you might call an objective difference between yourself and other people. They all involve the thought that the reason you should be specially concerned for yourself is you're more intelligent than other people, which presumably would also be a reason for everyone else to be specially concerned for you as well. If you think about it, I mean, you know, no coherent version of ethical egoism could possibly see things like that, right? I mean, ethical egoism is going to be the sort of everyone has a special reason to be concerned about him or herself, but, you know, it can't be that everyone is more intelligent, right? I mean, that's the late woebegone thing about how, you know, not all the children can be above average, right? It can't be that kind of difference to which the ethical egoist appeals. Right? But that's all Rachel's mentions. All he mentions are these, as you might say, objective differences. Surely, instead, what the sensible ethical egoist will appeal to is what you might call a subjective difference. So the way in which, for each of us, from each of our own point of view, our own interests have a special importance or salience, right? And see, that difference doesn't involve any assertion that, you know, you're more intelligent than everyone else or more sensitive than everyone else or anything like that, right? All it involves is the thought that, you know, from your point of view, right, for you, your interests have a special importance. Right? And so that is something that could coherently be held to be true of everyone, in a way that the claim that, you know, I'm more intelligent than other people could not. Right? Surely, therefore, that's what the ethical egoist is going to want to say. Right? And that's why Rachel's favourite argument's wrong. Right? Okay, I've got a slide that attempts to capture that point. That apostrophe shouldn't be there with others. I don't know why that's there. But get rid of it. So, I mean, for that reason, I want to say Rachel's favorite argument against ethical egoism fails. Therefore, I think our verdict on ethical egoism should be different from our verdict on psychological egoism. Given the default with respect to psychological egoism, the apparent evidence against it, and the lack of any powerful argument to overwhelm that apparent evidence against it, we argued last time psychological egoism is false. By contrast, properly understood, ethical egoism is really a view about rationality. So understood, it starts out as sort of one of the contenders, I mean not the only one, but one of them, right? And for all we can see from the arguments that Rachel considers in this chapter, we haven't seen decisive reason to endorse it, but nor have we seen decisive reason to reject it. So our verdict on ethical egoism, in contrast with our verdict on psychological egoism, should be something like, well, you know, it seems like it's one of the possible views, and we have seen neither decisive reason to endorse it nor decisive reason to reject it, so we should sort of keep an open mind on it. All right, that's a good place to stop.